I can state with confidence that the X-Men are many people's favorite thing in Marvel's pantheon. They're my favorite superhero team ever. But like most things in comics, when characters and teams have been around for a long time, it's hard to not rehash recurring elements. The X-Men, being an allegory for racism and the disenfranchised, stands at the very core of the team's existence. So how exactly do we make the X-Men interesting in this day and age? It starts with a man named Jonathan Hickman. Known for his work on the Fantastic Four, Avengers and New Avengers, and Secret Wars. That's a pretty impressive resume. So I was already interested to hear him write two 6-issue miniseries, House of X and Powers of 10, weekly titles that would bounce back and forth with each other to tell one big overarching story. And it turned out so much better than I could have ever anticipated. Men, women, children, and others, my name is Aaron from Panic in the Discord, giving you a review of the House of X and Powers of 10 series by Jonathan Hickman. I'm going to review both series as if they were one story because that's how they intend for it to be read. Jonathan Hickman wants you to read both series to get the bigger picture. And in fact, the hardcover collects both series in release order, so you wouldn't want to read one and not the other. Fair warning, there is going to be spoilers for House of X and Powers of 10 if you have not already read this series or just don't care about it. Welcome to the discussion. Usually when I read comics, the criteria I'm looking for to judge a quality book is the writing, art, thematic resonance, and ability to be read on release schedule and in trade. Let's first talk about the plot. Moira MacTaggert is a mutant with the ability to reincarnate as her younger self every time she dies, while retaining all of her memories and experience from her previous lifetime.
Time travel!
After a disastrous run-in with the Brotherhood of Mutants in one of her lives, she devotes her remaining lifetimes to aiding mutant kind in their survival against the human race. There's a lot to unpack here and plenty I haven't even mentioned, but that's the best way that I could summarize the concept for the series. The biggest thing that this story does is make Moira MacTaggert an interesting character. It's a huge retcon for Moira, but it's one that honestly works so well and makes her so much more important to the X-Men mythos. Before, she was just that one human who supported the X-Men, and while I know that some people are upset that that angle is no longer applicable, it works in the context of the story, and I will explain this later. Seeing Moira constantly lose, and to keep seeing the demise of mutant kind in pretty much every life she lives after being involved with the X-Men makes her interesting. There's something so haunting about Moira wanting to break the kindness in Professor X's heart in order to ensure the survival of their species. But you totally understand her desperation and why she feels like she has to do that. While so much is explained through Moira's perspective, our emotional tether to this book is the X-Men. Let's address the skin-tight, makerish elephant in the room, Charles Xavier. In the very first scene of this story, we see people being made from pods, Xavier mysteriously standing over them in a messianistic stance, uttering his famed "To me, my X-Men" line. It's a very unnerving beginning to the story, but it's the story's way of letting you know that things are much different now. Earlier I asked how do we make the X-Men interesting again, and Jonathan Hickman comes in with very polarizing results. What you have is the entirety of mutant kind banding together as one civilization in the island of Krakoa. That's right, they have their own country, their own language, their own culture, and technology. A mass gathering of mutants isn't entirely original, but this approach that Hickman takes in asserting the dominance of mutants over the humans is what makes this so captivating. The mutants are tired of being oppressed, they're tired of being hunted and killed. The Professor X that we once knew is no longer the man that he is now. This is a point of contention for many, as they believe that this betrays what makes Xavier such a great character at his core. Someone who always looked to the bright side of humanity and wanted to coexist with them no matter how bad things have gotten. And I understand that, but we do get that Xavier in this story. We're just seeing it from Moira's perspective. We know that Xavier has persisted in other lifetimes with this way of thinking, and it always ends in the extinction of their species. Xavier, having seen what Moira has seen, is still trying to find ways to make his original dream work, but Moira has broken him, and he is now this isolationist figure that we see in the story because of it. Even when Moira is not present in the story, the effects of her very presence are strongly felt throughout the entire thing. Everything that happens is predicated on her. We want the X-Men to win just as much as she does. So when we see that the mutants have taken residence on Krakoa and created their own culture, it's an equal part satisfying and worrying. The most common complaint I hear about House of X is that Hickman makes the mutant race act like a giant cult. And I'm not even going to argue with it because you could look at it that way, but we're looking at it from an outsider's perspective. From the outside looking in, yeah, they're doing a lot of weird things, but it's a new beginning for their people and they can finally exercise a culture. I'm sure that there are questionable practices that you don't agree with in real life about other cultures, and it's no different here. If Alabama could get away with sister fucking, then the mutants can get away with this. Let them have it. Anyways, on the visual side of things, the art is incredible throughout. Pepe Larraz and RB Silva on House of X and Powers of 10 respectively complement each other's styles so well. They bring this book to life in a way I don't think many artists could do this day and age. Krakoa looks luscious and beautiful, and the character designs are great, with one glaring exception.
I'm about to cyberbully.
Who the fuck thought that it was a good idea to bring this look back for Jean Grey? We just came off the heels of X-Men Red with this okay-ish red and blue suit. Xavier and Magneto got a makeover, why couldn't Jean get one? She looks like if the 70s was a person and their vomit was Jean's costume. That doesn't fly this day and age. It was a thing of its time, so let it stay where it came from. It's only an antiquated and anachronistic notion in this day and age. Almost everyone has a modernized look to them now.
What kind of shit is that?
Anyways, the art is really good. It's interesting to see Larraz and Silva's takes on the same scene. Larraz is a bit more heavier on the inks than Silva, but Silva is a little bit more expressive. Both are a little cartoony, but in a good way. Silva makes the future look tangible but hopeless, while Larraz has a very unnerving air in the present. The action is dynamic and tense and serves the story. I also personally love these data pages. Now I don't know for sure who made these. I want to say Hickman put these together himself. Regardless, they're informative without being intrusive, because you don't necessarily have to read these data pages, but they give some pretty interesting lore on the story being presented here. Plus, it's nice that Hickman puts this much detail into the lore as it shows how much he cares about his work. Wait, hold on. Hydra is a part of Orchis?
Nazis. I hate these guys.
Orchis is essentially the main villain for the present in House of X. The way that the whole story moves in between timelines and still lets you feel the threat that exists in every era of the X-Men only drives home the point that mutants aren't ever safe and will continuously be hunted no matter the time period. But easily the most emotional moments stem from the present. House of X issues 3 and 4 was some of the most gut-punching issues of comics last year for good reason. 4 especially, with this beautiful moment between Wolverine and Nightcrawler. And even though we know that these characters won't stay dead due to the nature of the comic world, it doesn't cheat itself out of any emotion. Me knowing full well that they would come back didn't stop this moment from being beautiful, since I love both of these characters and their sacrifice was just so perfectly done. Call me a simp if you like, but that shit was beautiful, and the tragedy displayed throughout this whole issue was emotionally gripping. Xavier's monologue at the end, the back matter material basically showing all of the major atrocities committed against the mutant race, was all around perfect and just might be my favorite issue out of the 12 in this story. My only real problem with this issue is how useless Jean is here. She cries the entire time and is boiled down to a damsel in distress, which is stupid for a character who is an omega level telepath. Now admittedly, this doesn't really take away from the emotion in this issue when you realize that Professor X is telepathically connected to everyone in that room, who is subsequently connected to Jean Grey, who is subsequently connected to all of the X-Men at the Orchis Forge, so when each of them die, Jean Grey is feeling each and every one of their deaths, but since she's connected to Xavier, he is also feeling each and every one of their deaths, while everyone in that room is also feeling all of their deaths by proxy of being connected to Xavier. Point being that Jean is feeling everyone's deaths as they're happening, and so is Xavier. So when she's at her most vulnerable, her escape pod is ripped apart by Sentinels, and she's screaming into the vacuum of space with no help, and it's truly a heartbreaking scene.
Another one. Another one. Another one. Another one. Another one. And another one. And another one.
Which transitions nicely into the thematic resonance of the story. We're ultimately dealing with an oppressed people that are finally taking a stand and are tired of being oppressed. But this is offset by the inevitability of their loss at the end of every road, and we're seeing all of these endings happen as Moira is. So she knows better than anyone else just how futile their efforts are in saving their own people. They are always doomed to fail, but Xavier and Magneto are trying their hardest to persuade themselves that this is their shot at finally winning. The juxtaposition between this false hope and their inevitable doom creates such a disturbing air around this whole book once it reaches the ending and recontextualizes the entire story. You want them to win. You can tell how desperate Moira is, how desperate Xavier and Magneto are, and how hopeful all of the mutants on Krakoa are. But only so few know the truth about the fate of their kind. It's encouraging but unsettling at the same time, seeing Xavier and Magneto so confident in this last-ditch effort to save their people, only to know that it'll end up in their annihilation regardless. We see this at the end of the far future in Powers of 10 issue 6. While it is very wordy and is nothing but expository dialogue, the reveal is still very much effective. Knowing that Moira has lived through 1,000 years just to find out that the end of the road for mutants is their erasure is a devastating truth to figure out. Living that long also must make you go crazy. And that's exactly what happens when all of her subsequent lives happen. She snaps and tries to assassinate the Trasks. That doesn't work. She teams up with Magneto. That doesn't work. She teams up with Apocalypse. That doesn't work. She's only confirming the terrible truth she learned in a previous life several times over. So she finally has to resort to breaking the soul and spirit of a man she once loved and isn't even batting an eye to it. We see a reformed Professor X, but we understand why and we understand his argument. We may not like what he's doing, but we can't argue with his motivation, and it's this dichotomy that makes this story so great. You're rooting for characters who are going to lose in the end, as they always have and always will. And while there isn't really a concrete conclusion to this story, since it's technically the springboarding of the Dawn of X relaunch, it wraps up well enough to satisfactorily string together most plot threads here, but leaves enough room to be answered in the future of the X-Men. Which for all intents and purposes, makes this the perfect starting point for new readers trying to get into the X-Men. You really don't need to know much about them going into this story, although you do lose a lot of context. The genius thing about House of X is that Hickman does not alienate things that every writer before him had done with the X-Men. He respects their work while putting a new spin on continuity that makes it accessible for new readers at the same time, so both camps can enjoy this book. It transitions well into the Dawn of X so that if you enjoy these 12 issues, it might incentivize you to start reading X-Men books on a regular basis. Fans of Hickman know that he is a very long-term style of writer, so he usually pays off dangling plot threads in a big way. It's very possible that we might see some of the payoff for ideas that were built up in House of X very far down the line. And while they will inevitably return the X-Men to the status quo, you could bet that Hickman has a giant conclusion in mind that'll wrap up everything in a nice bow. Getting into things I didn't like about the book is not a long list at all, and admittedly these aren't even huge problems, but just minor irritations. I already mentioned that Jean sucks, and that it purposely isn't a complete conclusion, but I also wanted to talk about the way that the story progressively unfolds. Since the story tries to recontextualize itself as more and more about the story is revealed, there's a lot of repeated imagery here. In fact, the beginning of Powers of 10 issues 1 and 6 are the exact same. Not a giant problem, but that's page real estate that could have gone elsewhere. Lastly, the Year 1000 story isn't super interesting. It's a lot of technological jargon, but it also doesn't really have enough screen time to justify how much detail Hickman pours into this alternate future. It does pay itself off in the end with the reveal, but it was so different from the rest of the story that it felt a little out of place. Then again, this isn't really an issue if you read this in trade. This book, as it was coming out, was releasing issues weekly, and it was perfect for getting people on board for the new direction. Rereading this in trade didn't really make that much of a difference since I was already loving it week to week, but it did make the Year 1000 story slightly more tolerable. Other than that, there was virtually no difference reading this in trade than there was reading it week to week. I was having a blast reading it throughout the fall of 2019, and I only found more things to love about the book when I reread it all at once. I could really go on and on singing the praises of this book. I haven't even mentioned this moment with Namor, this moment of Magneto being awesome, this wonderful conversation between Xavier and Magneto, this scene discussing Krakoan politics, how Hickman made these 5 insanely important. But if my recommendation wasn't already made clear, I think this book is incredible and is something that needs to be read. I don't like giving ratings because I feel like people would just skip to the end to see the number or letter and ignore the entire review. So if you made it this far, you should already know how I feel about it. New reader trying to get into the X-Men? Read it. You're an X-Men vet? Still read it. Everyone in between needs to read it. It's not a perfect book, but the problems with the book barely, if at all, detract from the overall experience. But I've been talking too damn much. I want to know what you guys thought about House of X and Powers of 10. Did you love it? Hate it? Leave a comment down below and let's have a civilized discussion. Also, let me know what you want me to talk about next. Follow myself and the crew on all of our social media. Links will be in the description below. Once again, this is Aaron from Panic in the Discord, and have an amazing rest of your day.